Hi. Okay. I've lost my voice, so this will be a lot of fun. How is everybody else?
Okay.
We're going to give everybody a couple of minutes to get on, and then I'll welcome everybody and then probably not talk the rest of the time. We lost Beth again. Hassan's going to tell us all the stuff that's going on in Detroit, right?
Celia, what is happening to your voice?
I don't know. I caught a cold. It was horrible. But I had a deer walk by the window just a couple of minutes ago, so there was that. So greetings from can you see the pretty landscape out there?
Oh, nice.
Yeah. I'm in New Jersey. It's fall in New Jersey. And it's cold. But Christine's got like 2 or 3 feet of snow in Boulder, Colorado.
Oh.
How's the weather, Chad? Or is it toasty warm?
Yeah, it is nice. I'm actually in Port Lincoln today. Population of about 16,000, a few hours outside of Adelaide in South Australia. But yeah, it's Australian October, so or November, October still, yeah. But yeah, it's absolutely gorgeous. Dark, cold, but gorgeous.
My son just landed in Australia, so.
Where's he going?
I think he's going to Manning Valley to go woofing, but he's having a hard time finding farms. So he says work away isn't working.
Yeah, I don't know. All right. Well, is he going to get up to Queensland at all?
He will try, maybe. I don't know.
Yeah.
So, hi,
Well,
Katie.
connect us, and if there's anything I can do to help.
All right. If you know somebody who will put him to work for a month and a half, that would be great. Okay.
Cool.
So, in the interest of time and trying to save my voice,
you got your Kathleen Sullivan voice on.
Yeah. It's just not feeling that sexy right now, though.
I'm sorry.
That's all right. Thank you. Okay. So welcome to the Goal 7 call. Thank you for this. It's good to see your smiling faces. And I feel like, oh, Jennifer doesn't want us. Come on, let's just watch Jennifer eat. You know, okay. So let's see, question of the day to start us off and hop around. Since I'm a little bit under the weather, I don't feel as bad as I sound. I'm going to ask you what your go-to comfort food is, because it's just like that kind of weather. And when you're not feeling well and you got to just get through the day and you need to feel that nurturing feeling, what is your go-to comfort food? So I will start with Carol.
Mac and cheese. How about Chad?
For me, it's, yeah, I think it's anything carbs. So anything from chips to bread to anything. My body craves, I think, what I don't need. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's my go-to. Might go to Beth. Beth, what about you?
No, I actually go to, when I'm really feeling under the weather, I go to cinnamon toast, cinnamon sugar on buttered toast. How about Kristen?
I love talking about food. Thank you for this opportunity. When I was a kid, always it was pastina. I don't know if people know what that is, but it's teeny, teeny, tiny star-shaped pasta, but you make it like a soup with butter and salt. And then when I grew up and got out of my Italian household, it became pho.
What?
Pho, which is like a noodle soup. It's basically variations on noodle soup from Italian to Asian anything in between, any kind of noodly soup does me right when I'm not feeling right.
Yeah.
You gotta pick somebody, Kristen.
Okay, I always forget to do that. Let's see, Hassan.
It'll be chicken noodle soup for me. And I will go over to my right, Cecilia.
You know, I would go with chicken soup, but not noodles. Growing up in an Asian household, it would be chicken and rice soup. So that's my go-to. And Katie.
Cream of tomato soup with the grilled cheese sandwich.
And that would leave Jennifer, who's eating at her desk. What are you eating? Gravy? What? Okay, do you put French fries in your gravy?
What?
No, that's a Northeast Coast thing, right? French fries and brown gravy. Unless you go up to Toronto and then you put cheese in it and have poutine. Okay. Mashed potatoes or meatloaf. That's a good thing. All right. Jennifer, we let you pass so you could eat your whatever it is you're eating right now. Okay. So we were going to talk about case studies on sustainability, and I think I sent around the email asking Beth to start, but I think we're going to go with Hassan. So Hassan's got a whole bunch of stuff happening in, and Hassan went to go visit a local entrepreneur that I kind of introduced him to. So I'm really excited. So the next couple of minutes, what we're going to do is hear about some cool stuff that's going on in Detroit. And I'd love for you to also talk about, there's a story that you told me about Dearborn and Ford, and like where we misstep sometimes in trying to get stuff going on. Hi, Rob. So I'd love to hear what works, what doesn't work, what's happening, things like that. So Hassan's going to give us a brief. Well, you've got like 15 minutes to talk about Detroit, but first we'll welcome Rob. Rob, our question of the day is, what is your go-to comfort food when you're not feeling well? Because my voice is gone. Do I need to unmute you? Or you're hoping that we weren't going under the wire? I'm going to unmute you. I don't have that ability. Okay, there you go.
It's me.
Yes.
Yes. Top comfort food?
Mhm.
Gotta go with mashed potatoes.
Okay, you and Jennifer with the mashed potatoes. Do you get meatloaf with it too?
What was that?
Do you get meatloaf with your mashed potatoes too?
Oh, yeah, I didn't think about meatloaf, but that is
see?
an excellent choice.
Now we're making everybody hungry. All right, I'm going to put you back on mute. And Hassan, it's up to you.
Thank you, Celia. I don't know if I have 15 minutes worth of stuff, but I will talk. So there's quite a few interesting things happening in Detroit actually right now. So the Forbes 30 Under 30 conference is actually in Detroit today through the 30th. Last week we had the National Immigrant Integration Conference was also in Detroit. And also last week, the New Economy Initiative, which is an initiative out of the Community Foundation for Southeast Michigan. So the New Economy Initiative started about seven years ago. And idea was to connect and help fund entrepreneur and startup activity here in Detroit and Southeast Michigan. So the New Economy Initiative last week, their network convening, which was pretty much most of the players in the ecosystem in Detroit and the surrounding areas. Andy actually spoke at that convening. So that brought together the ecosystem here in Southeast Michigan to talk. Andy talked about the emerging field of ecosystem building. So exposed that to the whole network here in Southeast Michigan. And there were also flash talks. There were talks about diversity and inclusion, about inclusive design. So this was a full day convening, and the convening actually took place at the Henry Ford, which is formerly called the Henry Ford Museum, but it's now, I can't remember the exact title, but they have innovation in their title because of the history of Henry Ford and innovation. So it brought, and the museum actually is not in Detroit, it's in Dearborn. So I do a lot of work in Detroit and also in Dearborn, which is a city adjacent to Detroit, and it's where Ford World Headquarters is and where Ford Motor Company's engineering labs and their test tracks and all of their mobility stuff is happening. So it's kind of interesting to see all of these people, step outside of, because Dearborn, although it sits adjacent to Detroit, is often overlooked and does not generally, because of a lot of the funding actually goes into, a lot of the entrepreneurial activity funding goes specifically into Detroit and not into Dearborn. And Dearborn has a deep and rich history of innovation and also immigration. Started with, there was an influx of Italian immigrants at one point, and then with every war that's broken out in the Middle East, there's an influx going back to the 1960s, and it's always tied to issues in the Middle East. So whenever there is a conflict in the Middle East, there's an influx of immigration. So Dearborn has a very large immigrant population, particularly from the Middle East and from all so across the Middle East and into North Africa. Along with that, one of the other things that happened last week is that the New Economy Initiative also unveiled that they're going to use a platform called Startup Space to be the platform where entrepreneurs can live, where business support organizations can live, where storytelling initiatives can live. So it's going to be interesting to see how that, although and I know a lot of people that actually come into the Detroit area and into Southeast Michigan say that our ecosystem here is much more evolved than a lot of other places, and that's primarily because so the history of Detroit going back about 6 years is we had a bankruptcy. The city was in bankruptcy, and then we had a vacuum in leadership. The mayor was indicted, ended up serving time in federal prison. So there was a vacuum in leadership, and a lot of foundations, including the community foundation, ended up taking the role that municipal government would normally play. So the entrepreneurial activity and the ecosystem support happened a lot quicker and in a much more organized manner than it would have because of the bureaucracy of city government. So I think that's probably why we ended up where we are, and we tend to be a little further ahead because we ended up coming together as business support organizations and funders and building out our ecosystem without having to deal with the bureaucracy of municipal government and county government. So that's an interesting dynamic in that it's going to be interesting to see how the ecosystem here uses that platform because there have been other solutions in the past to try to do exactly what this platform does. So it'll be interesting to see how the players in the ecosystem, how it'll get adopted, and if the storytelling initiatives will live on there the way it's intended. So that's kind of the developments that have happened here in Detroit over the last week or so. And I'm happy to answer any questions or delve deeper into anything that I talked about. But in a nutshell, that's pretty much the development here out of Detroit. And I know there's similar things happening in other ecosystems around the country, but that's where we're at in Detroit.
had a question.
Yeah, I do. So that's really interesting because I work in. We set up our hub in Ipswich, local government model, and in a similar way, our mayor's in jail. The entire council got fired. Corruption at the government level, and but the council kind of reformed, and they still have a strong presence in driving it forward, which I see is shutting down a lot of the community-led activities. As you've seen the not-for-profit space mobilize in that space to become a proxy for what the government was doing, are you seeing structures form? Like, is there like a backbone organization type of, to use that language? Is there something forming, and how much are you relying on a digital platform to be a bit of that glue that a separate governance body might hold? Like, it's local, it's either government, municipality, some other collaborative body to act as that, or platforms, digital platforms, which might fill some of that function. Where do you see what you're doing as far as fitting in that? And do you need a separate governance body?
So we have a variety of committees. So there's quasi-government stuff, private, public partnership things happening. This is the first, I think this is the first digital platform that we've kind of, well, I take that back. There was one probably about 4 or 5 years ago that the regional chamber here in Detroit attempted to launch, and it didn't take on the way it was expected. But there are, I mean, so there are things that are coming out of city government. There's the Detroit Economic Growth Corporation, which is also part of city government. They've created these positions called business district managers. So for every neighborhood across the city has a district business manager who serves as the liaison for entrepreneurs in the small business community, between the entrepreneurs and municipal government. I guess for a lack of a better word, it's almost like mayor of that little neighborhood without any authority of being a mayor, but you serve the role as the liaison in that neighborhood between the small business community and the mayor's office. And there are various other committees around the city. There's a committee around gaps, business gaps in the neighborhoods. And the gaps that have been identified are the digital divide, access to capital, and access to commercial real estate. And there are small working groups in each one of those areas that have convened to try to address the issues of access to commercial real estate, the digital divide, and access to capital. But there are, I mean, there's initiatives coming out of nonprofits, there's initiatives out of city governments, and then there are corporate initiatives. So Ford, and this is outside of Detroit, but in Dearborn, Ford has convened a group that they call the Business Leaders Group. So it's a group that convenes every 2 weeks, and it consists of folks from the universities, from the local hospitals, business leaders, nonprofits, residents of neighborhoods. And every 2 weeks they meet to talk about master plan, about commercial corridor development. And ideas, I mean, sometimes there aren't any tangible things that come out of the meetings, and at times there are, but it's just getting all of those players in the same room every 2 weeks. I mean, I've seen, so this is, I think, about 3 years on now, and there has been an enormous amount of development since that group started to convene, and simply because people are now all on the same page. So you have all these players that were operating separately, doing their own separate things, but convene every 2 weeks to talk about what they are doing individually. And as a result, they're pretty much all aligned now across the city. And I hope I answered your question. I know I went off on a...
Hassan, I'm sorry, I missed, it's the business leaders, that's the group that's meeting every other week or every 2 weeks?
Yeah.
And are they economic development professionals, or are they actual CEOs of businesses?
So so it's senior level leadership at different organizations. So it's folks from Ford Land, which is Ford Motor Company's real estate development arm. It's economic development folks from the city. It's senior leadership from the university and the community college and from the hospitals. And it's also business owners.
Cool. So it's a mix. That's great. We have something in Erie called the Lead Economic Development Team, but it's a mishmash of economic development related organizations, and not necessarily everyone has been invited to the table. So it's, kind of the same similar model, but just not as inclusive as it sounds like what you got going on. That's great.
Yeah, the interesting thing is the downtown development authorities also have funded for that storytelling initiatives for that group. So to talk about small business activity and entrepreneurial activity. So that story of what this group is working on gets told.
So I wanted to mention a couple of things. So David Ponrash, who runs Startup Space, was at ESHIP. So maybe some of you have met him. He's been to Startup Champions Summit. My question, Hassan, is were the gaps identified by the people, or were the gaps identified by leadership and government or policymakers? And then also, when you're, to Beth's question about the people that are in the room, is it an open meeting? Is it that anyone can attend, or do you have to go by invitation? Because I think sometimes it's really hard because we end up with very curated conversations because the groups are very curated. So I'm curious to hear what happens. Like Beth says, with her organization, some people aren't invited, so that never becomes an open discussion.
So two things. So the committees that are working on the gaps, all of those committees consists of representatives from business support organizations from across the city, from all the different neighborhoods. So folks that are serving tech, folks that are serving neighborhood businesses, nonprofits, folks that are operating capital programs. So it's a wide mix of business support organizations from across the city who are serving different types of entrepreneurs. The business leaders group, the other thing, the business leaders group, that is not an open meeting. So it's a meeting of leadership from all of these different organizations, but there are nonprofits who represent very specific communities that are in that meeting, but it's not an open meeting. But there are other meetings around the city. So in the city of Detroit, there is a neighborhood framework strategy group that meets, and that meeting consists of folks from the city planning department, from nonprofits across the city. And it also consists of people that run block clubs, residents of neighborhoods. So that meeting includes a wider mix of people and from different spaces.
So there is like no spirit guide or backbone support organization for the ecosystem as a whole, but everyone seems to be working together and are very familiar with all the pieces and parts.
So if I were to say there's a backbone support organization, it would be for the ecosystem. Probably that would be the New Economy Initiative. So they act as more than anything, as a convener. And the folks at the New Economy Initiative they're pretty much in the trenches with the business support organizations. So it's not like a top-down thing. It's pretty much they're in the trenches, and more than anything, they're acting as a convener that pulls all of these different players in the ecosystem together. And I think part of it is they've been doing it for a little over 7 years now. They're a funder, which being a funder helps get people into a room together. But they're well respected and they're trusted by all the different organizations. So I would say that would be a backbone organization.
Are they ready for a roadshow?
I'm sorry?
Is NEI ready for a roadshow so to show other communities how this works?
Absolutely. I know the folks there pretty well, and I'm sure that they would welcome sharing what they've done with others.
Thanks for the link, Jennifer. Chad, you had a question then?
Yeah, it was a similar one as far as what would we consider the backbone, because the New Economy Initiative, is that the same as the Ford Group, or is that different?
That's different. It's a different group.
Okay. Because that Ford Group is getting all the players together, but it sounds like they're more executing, whereas the New Economy Initiative is more of that higher level, and also acting as the funding, even though Ford would be considered as, does Ford fund any of the initiatives that come out of that business leaders group?
So they do put some money behind some of the initiatives, yeah.
But the Ford Group would be considered one of the programs among many, of which the New Economy Initiative then also has a bit of a convening role, yes?
So the Ford thing is completely separate from the New Economy Initiative.
So Hassan, you said the New Economy Group is also helping existing businesses, correct?
Yeah. Yep.
Because that's the connection you made with Tony over at Hot Sand. Hopefully you talked to Lauren this time.
Yeah. So they had I mean, I'll give you an example. There's a storytelling initiative that the New Economy Initiative announced that they're convening to tell the stories of small businesses in Detroit. One of the things that the New Economy Initiative has done over the last, I think it's going on its fourth year now. They had a challenge called the Any Ideas Challenge, and basically it was a program that they launched to help small businesses that have been in operation for 3 years or more, who have an idea to grow their business. It was a $10,000 grant specific directly to business owners. So they had, if the business grossed under $1 million, there was a $10,000 grant. And it was a pitch. You fill out just a really short application, and then it's judged. And there were 30 winners every single year that received a $10,000 grant, either because they needed some sort of facade improvement, or they needed to buy new equipment for the business, or they just had an idea to grow their business and needed capital to do it. So that was a $10,000 grant. And if the business grossed over $1 million, there was a $100,000 grant. So there were three $100,000 grants a year and 30 $10,000 grants. So that program is now going on its fourth year.
What are the outcomes? Is it listed on their website, you think?
Yeah. So if you and again, if you Google, I can type in I'll look up the link. It's the New Economy Initiative is the website, and then that challenge I was talking about is called the Any Ideas. So it's the letter N, the letter E, and then Ideas Challenge. And they list all of the different businesses and the story behind each business.
And I looked it up, even I answered my own question I had put in chat. So it's $134 million total investment. At least that was the impact report from 2016. So it might be more by now, but at least that was the planned amount. And it looks like there were maybe 5, 6 different, like how much did the Community Foundation put into that 134? Do you know that?
I don't know off the top of my head, but I could probably find out.
Okay. I'm just curious because I think to Beth's point about the roadshow, to have some sense of scale for other communities, looking at the asset size, let's say, of their community foundation, to understand what an appropriate or equivalent level of investment might be for different communities might be helpful.
Yeah, and I may get one of the foundations wrong, but I know some of the organizations that were funding the New Economy Initiative included the Ford Foundation, Kresge.
Yeah. Big daddies. some
Hassan,
big ones there.
You started.
I have a question about that thing. Is it limited to any geographic area, or is it it's not limited by community, or is it just inside of the city boundaries, or is it does it include the less populated areas outside of the city proper?
Yeah, so the Community Foundation for Southeast Michigan, and I may be off by the number, it's either 9 or 13 counties across Southeast Michigan. So that's the footprint for the Community Foundation. And the New Economy Initiative, which is an initiative out of the Community Foundation. Most of their entrepreneurial activity is focused on Detroit, Hamtramck, and Highland Park. although they do fund activities outside of Detroit.
Mm-hmm.
But the primary focus is Detroit, Hamtramck, and Highland Park. Highland Park is a city adjacent to Detroit, and Hamtramck is another city which is bordered by Detroit. It's inside the city of Detroit.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Hassan, we started off with talking about the political impacts of the mayor and some of the corruption there. Is there any correlation between that conversation and what we're seeing with NEI and the community fund? Did the community fund step into that, or did all that political stuff just kind of happen across the side and NEI kept going forward? Like, what was the correlation between those two events?
What was happening in the mayor's office did not impact what NEI was doing. As a matter of fact, I think it probably helped it along a lot quicker because there was nothing in the way of what the New Economy Initiative would have been doing, because things that the mayor's office traditionally would have wanted to have control of, because of the vacuum in leadership in the mayor's office, there were all these other things outside of the mayor's office that were able to take off without having to deal with what was happening in the mayor's office. But an interesting thing is now the mayor's office currently is now trying, in a strange way, is doing a lot of the same things that the New Economy Initiative was doing. So the business district liaisons, which were positions that were created out of the city, in a strange way, some of the business support organizations that were funded and supported by NEI were doing that within those neighborhoods. But now that the city government is stable, they've created these other positions that are serving that role. Where before those positions were created, neighborhood-based business service organizations were pretty much doing that anyway.
Good boy.
And so in your view, with government stepping back in, do you think that's going to be serving the community or simply serving to justify the government having a role in the community?
Well, I think unless something changes, the New Economy Initiative is set to sunset in a few years. And I don't know if there will be the same type of, because the city now is at a much completely different place than it was 7 years ago or even 2 years ago. So I don't know if there will be the same type of philanthropic support for entrepreneurial activities 5 years from now as there was 5 years ago. So I think city government will have to play some sort of role in providing that type of support. So I think the positions that they've created and the role that they're playing is going to be an important role. But I think they've learned lessons from what the business support organizations and what NEI was doing, so that the model of how the city will provide services is different than what they would have provided had it not been for NEI and these business support organizations that built up.
Well, it'll be really interesting to see what they do around sustainability as they're preparing for the sunset. Would be great lessons for us all if they're going to. I would think they seem pretty progressive. I would think that they do plan to manage that well.
Yeah, it's good. I mean, I don't think there's any clear indication of exactly what the next iteration will be, but I think there's a strong and heavy focus, and it was shown last week in the convening, that there will be a focus on the ecosystem and maintaining the ecosystem that now exists.
Cool.
It's interesting.
I'm sorry, Chad, we're on the same biological clock, I think, because every time I talk. So you go first.
Thanks, Katie. Different time zone, same clock.
That's
Hey,
right.
I think just as an observation, it'd be interesting. Like I've experienced and I've heard of situations, where you have corruption in the local government or the local government getting away, and so therefore the community steps in. Just as an abstract, question, observation. It would be interesting to identify what the flip is, where you do have an active local government that is actually contributing in a way that's stable, that actually acts as an enabler. So a lot of criticism against government, of which I share from personal experience in a few situations, but having those positive priming agents to say, okay, well, this is what it could look like. Albeit I haven't seen too many of them, but where they can actually act on a functional role for ecosystem development in a local area.
Well, I used Skylar Yost from York, Pennsylvania as an example, because his role is actually as an ecosystem builder for the city of York. So his role is to support the infrastructure, and that's a forward-thinking thing for a city to do. And obviously it's paid off, since they are now, they've got several $1 million in robotics grants and innovation going on over there. Right. So Katie, you had something you wanted to share or ask?
Let me get myself off mute. I've been thinking a lot about this with the program that I run here, and I'm in the process of mapping it. We have the NC IDEA Foundation, which is run by the former head of the Kauffman Foundation here in North Carolina, and they are putting on the first ever North Carolina Entrepreneurial Ecosystem Summit next month. And there are all kinds of things going on, and I think it seems like ecosystem has become the fashionable word, like innovation was the fashionable word. And I'm not sure that people know what an ecosystem is. It's, it's just the hot thing, like kale. So I've been trying to map my programs to the 7 elements of an entrepreneurial ecosystem, just to add some credibility when we use that word. And I'm wondering if you guys are doing anything similar to that, because it seems like the word ecosystem is just getting thrown around, and I don't think most people know what it is.
I could say in Detroit, there have been various efforts over the last few years to map out the ecosystem. I know SourceLink worked on something about 1.5 years ago for Southeast Michigan. I know prior to that, there was something called the BizGrid, BIZGRID. And I think that still lives somewhere online, which mapped out the entrepreneurial ecosystem in and around Detroit. One other thing I wanted to add, so outside of Detroit and Dearborn created this umbrella organization called Downtown Dearborn, which is outside of the it's not part of the Economic Development Office for the city, and it's not part of the Downtown Development Authorities. It's sort of this umbrella organization that has facilitated a lot of placemaking initiatives, entrepreneurial initiatives, because it doesn't sit within economic development, and it also doesn't sit within the traditional Downtown Development Authority. It's an umbrella organization that convenes all of those different entities.
So since we mentioned SourceLink, Rob, why don't you talk to us about mapping ecosystems and using the word ecosystem?
Sure. Yeah, so SourceLink, we've done a number of different mapping projects and asset identification projects, including Southeast Michigan. Actually, we worked with NEI on that particular effort as well. So yeah, I'm happy to answer any questions about that project or about how we approach and think about doing some of that mapping work. In terms of the entrepreneurial ecosystem phrase itself, I would generally agree that there's a lot of confusion around what exactly that means. My background, so my dad's a botanist. My mom is political scientist. And so you can imagine at my house, there were always a lot of debates about why we're applying biological terms to political science or to the science of economic development. And it's always a very interesting conversation at my house. And I get the connection, and I totally understand it. But yeah, I also understand where there's some confusion about it. I know for our purposes, we've been kind of moving away from ecosystem and referring to building entrepreneurial infrastructure or economic development infrastructure, because in a lot of ways, especially with economic developers, they understand traditional infrastructure. And when you think about building pathways to entrepreneurship and making sure that you have the right on-ramps and you're creating access, there's actually quite a few different ways that you could kind of parallel the work that we do with infrastructure. So anyway, that's my 2 cents.
I think we started talking about ecosystems probably more so when, around Victor and the Rainforest book. And in 2017, when the call came out for the ESHIP Summit, I didn't know what the heck an ecosystem builder was. So I just went to the party because I was invited. But I know Valto says that in Europe, they use ecosystem developer. Chad, what do you use in Australia?
Yeah, there's a divide. So there's a lot of terminology around ecosystem. People use it in the absence of anything else. And so it's a bit of a default. Communities. I see some words going around tribes, but that's a little bit clicky. I do, I agree with Rob as far as it depends on the audience you're talking to. We have startup festivals, startup activities, innovation festivals, or events, conferences. We are just now starting to see some role positions as far as ecosystem builder, not so much. So most community leader, response leaders in the community. I want to much do the words element, part development portfolio, a niche of your economic development and community development portfolios that often isn't looked at by a traditional. And so that whole narrative, which then they get it, whereas ecosystem still is a bit too skinny jeans, black t-shirt.
Thanks for that. Hey, Kristen, I'm curious to know how your community syncing and synergy revolves and kind of compares and contrasts to what Hassan described.
Well, I think we're at the beginning of what they must have done 7-8 years ago, right? I think we've had an initial, we use the term innovation economy, by the way. That works for us. And that's the kind of umbrella under which we all sit. And we've had an annual convening called the State of Entrepreneurship now for 5 years. And that the people invited are it's not inclusive, it's curated. And so we're working to expand that. But it's weird, like we've had this very long 10-year history now of people gathering in an ecosystem kind of way, and even some funders convening around it, but it's been very dispersed and not coordinated and not with all the right players at the table. And we're very much in the shadows of a strong regional EDC, Economic Development Corp. So they are the ones that actually have the regular quarterly to monthly meetings. They've controlled the sort of biggest splash events where people come out from Boston and the State House to the legislators all go through them. So it's been really not in the hands of the people doing the work. It's been in the hands of people controlling the politics and the narrative. And so we're trying to shift that, and that's happening slowly, but mostly right now we're meeting on our own. And so what I'm proposing in the next 3 months here is going to be a sea change for us. And I don't know if it'll take or not, but I am using the term ecosystem because it's new. And I think sometimes that, even though that's cynical, that does catch people's attention. And I'm using the analogy of a stew because of food and everybody gets that. So I talk about the different ingredients that go into an ecosystem stew to make it delicious. So I have this little slideshow. I present it everywhere for the last 7 months that I can get an invitation. And that's how I'm trying to socialize the term, so that going forward, when we mark a change in the culture, we'll have something to call ourselves as a group that's different than what we've done before in terms of just saying innovation economy. So we're at the beginning. Our funders are tentatively lined up to start a group like this. We're actually trying to decide who belongs at the table. So this conversation is really relevant and helpful, that we should include people from that aren't just doing ecosystem building work, but business leaders and others like that. So, you know, it'll be interesting to see if that takes. People really like provincialism where I am. It's like, it's hard won, deep cultural stuff. So I'm not sure how we're going to come together around this, but I do think people are beginning to recognize the necessity of it.
And for those who don't know, Kristen is in Springfield, Massachusetts, which is not Boston.
No. So, and we cover a 4-county region. So when you're in Boston, you're taught Western Mass as anything beyond Route 128, which is a highway that encircles Boston. But when you get to the Worcester, which is the next small city, they say they're Central Mass. Then you get to Springfield, we say we're Western Mass, and then you go another hour west and they say they're Western Mass, and that's the Berkshires. So it's hilarious. And there are 4 counties that we cover, some of which are very rural. And so, you know, it can be anything from you're on one side of the river to the other, and that divides us, the Connecticut River, and that often is a dividing line for real Western Mass. And then we have a small mountain range that people call the tofu curtain. And north of that, there be the liberals and the academics and the farmers, and south of that be the poor gateway cities where we also serve. So it's really hyper, you know, fragmented.
An interesting place. So in the interest of time, I want to make sure that if anybody has any updates on any of the project goals, on the project initiatives, that we give a couple minutes to share those. Wait, you're on mute. Hang on.
All right.
Carol.
I have a report on 7.3. Chad, we're sorry we missed you last week when Mary and I had the initial call. 7.3 is about certification and training programs. And so Mary and I divided up some tasks. She posted meeting notes on the Slack channel the day after our meeting. So they are there for anyone who wants to deep dive. We're not quite ready to start a canvas yet. We're kind of doing some preliminary research to kind of sort out the main direction for the canvas. One of my needs right now is to find out if anybody knows about certification or training programs in any field, most especially in economic development, but virtually in any field, because we want to kind of understand structures and key differences between, and pros and cons, of course, between some of the fundamental various flavors of, let's say, certification programs.
I know I reached out to PMP, the Professional Meeting Planners. No, well, I reached out to them as well, but there's a Professional Project Management Association, and I haven't heard back from them, but that would be a good organization since their field is relatively, I don't want to say new, but you can probably get a history of it because it's more recent than some other certification programs. So you may want to try those and some unions to see, because they do different levels of certification in I know, you know, electricians and carpenters and all of the union people would have, whether you're an apprentice or a journeyman or whatever. So they have varying levels. That might be a good start. So in the work that Christina's doing, trying to, as she talks to national resource providers, what's really helpful is if anybody's working on a project, to be able to fill out a project canvas so that she can share them with the national resource providers to see if we can get support for some of these efforts and initiatives. So that would be great. Chad, what did you throw in there?
Yeah, a couple of things. There's Startup Commons over in Europe is really focusing on the framework, both from a data and a professionalizations approach towards ecosystem building. And so they're working on some standardized type approaches with webinars, which then you get, I don't know if you get certification, but you get a tick that you completed the webinars. And the other one is that would come close to seeing them start using similar kind of language as INBIA. Who's, this language around intentionally building up ecosystem leaders related to our field. And I agree with Cecilia on the PMP stuff. I got PMP certified, went through that process, was part of the local chapter here in Queensland, and the structure they have for supporting project management as a standardized process is pretty robust, and also there's a lot of rigor behind it because it's a pretty difficult certification to achieve. It's not just a tick box. It's not just watching a few seminars. They actually have a 2 to 3 hour test that you have to pass. It's quite difficult.
So what's the first one you mentioned, Chad, before you mentioned NBIA? I didn't catch the name of it.
Startup Commons.
So Startup Commons,
The link
put the
is
link in
the chat.
Yeah. And they're interesting because they're combining both data and professionalization as two key pillars of what they do. Kind of for global ecosystem development. So they're an interesting one to watch. Just, I don't know if they would be getting down to the positions and the roles. I think they're just going general, here's an ecosystem building framework.
And Valto's on Slack, so Carol, if you ping Valto, I'm sure he'll be able
he's
to.
part of that? Okay.
Yeah.
Got it. Okay.
So,
They're good value.
Just a question then for you all working on this, Carol. I think in the last call we talked about looking at other industries like PMP that had done this sort of professionalization around something new. And so I did have a call with our local university that has a program in cybersecurity. We talked about that as an example.
Mm-hmm.
And she's willing to talk to whomever if that's something you want me to broker that connection. But it's a small department, but they're very professionally oriented at this university doing different kinds of certification programs. So she'd be happy to, if you're looking at formal programs for certification at university levels or colleges, she'd be happy to talk to you. So you can just message me and let me know on Slack.
Great. Yes, absolutely. That will be, we do want to interview several university folks, although my experience with the university world is there's just, like here in Illinois, as soon as you're tied to a state university, you're on a path that cannot be cut short of 2 years on just your approval after you've got all your documentation ready to submit. And in my experience, when I did the certification program that San Jose State ended up adopting, I created it for them. In those days, 25 years ago, there was not any kind of approval bureaucracy. So there's kind of some state by state differences on that front. And so I'm a little hesitant to embrace the university side, but we definitely want to check those boxes, have the conversations, be sure we're not missing something, because we want to have international reach. And I'm not sure if a university entity might be more useful or less in, being able to provide international training and certification.
Okay, they're called Bay Path University if you want to look them up. They're a very small entrepreneurial little outfit, far from a state institution, and they're focused on lifelong learners, particularly women. So it's an interesting little example if that's something you end up digging. They'd be probably more willing to entertain it than a big official university system.
Great. Okay.
So I don't know that there are any other projects, briefs, or initiatives that are going on right now. I know I've got a couple to load up to the dashboard, so that's coming along. So in the last 5 minutes, can we do a lightning round of takeaways that we learned either from Detroit or this call that said, this is something that I would do in my community, or this is what I learned we should not do in my community. How's that? So do you have a takeaway that that would be nice to have or not have? Chad? I'm going to start with Chad. If he's
Yeah,
still
cool.
there.
Thanks. Yeah. Just briefly, yeah, thanks, Hassan. I love it. Backbone organizations, the structure of them, how they form, the role of government, and it contributes to the work that I'm doing in building backbones and organizations. And it just adds that one more proof point on what are the governance structures that we need. So I'll definitely look into that one some more. And just looking at the difference on when government is healthy and not in that role. So, but thanks for that. It was great. I might hop over to Carol.
I would say I have a big takeaway on role of government with a big caution flag. My impression is that Detroit has a lot of very unique legacy issues. And I add that to, just what we've seen at the federal government level in this country in terms of how elections have consequences that can very easily all too easily just pull a plug on something. So I'm kind of sorting through mentally, how far to go without requiring a governmental dependence, just in order to avoid that vulnerability. So hearing Hassan certainly kind of confirmed that instinct that's been growing in my heart about being careful about too much governmental dependence. Okay, Katie?
So here in the Wake Tech has a countywide footprint because that's the way North Carolina has assigned their community colleges. We have 58 of them, and each one has a geography. And Wake County is the largest geography, so we cover that county, and we have 12 little towns. Well, they're not little. Raleigh is like the big gorilla. Then we have one called Cary, and they all kind of go down from there to one that has about 7,000 residents. And I was wanting to do something that was countywide, and we've taken the approach of, with my program, of going and embedding programs inside each town. And that's worked pretty well. The one time that I tried to do something across countywide, I ran into a little territorial politics and retreated pretty quickly. So I haven't figured out exactly how to do what we need to do without getting the politics involved. And once you get politics involved, it's not about values and impact anymore. It's all about egos and perception. So it's interesting hearing what Detroit has been able to do. I'd love to figure out how to duplicate that here. So it's something to keep in the back of my head, that maybe the little programs that we have in the 7 towns so far, maybe we start with those grassroots teams and just shame everybody else into coming on board.
All right, Katie, pick somebody.
Sorry, I went on mute too quickly. Beth.
Thanks, Katie, and thanks, Hassan. That was a great story. What I think, kind of along the lines with what everybody else is saying, it's reaffirming to me that community, as Brad Feld would say in his book, community is better equipped to do this than government. And when we started, we were grassroots, and now because we've made an impact, government is getting engaged and they're mucking it all up. So it might be harder in the beginning to do it from a grassroots level in the smaller neighborhoods or smaller towns, kind of spreading out that way. But I think in the long run, that's probably the way we should have gone. So again, thanks, Hassan. And I will popcorn over to Kristen. Did you go?
No, thanks, Beth. You know, big takeaway for me is the role of the convener and that the funders can play. It doesn't matter the price tag, but the minute they give anybody a little bit of money, they just have the ability to get them in the room. And I think that that's a really important role to remind them of. It's more important even than their continued funding, is that ability to get folks at the table. So thank you, Hassan. That's a huge takeaway. And I'm already emailed that new economy initiative to my community foundation president, which annoys her because I do that like daily. But definitely gonna shove that under their nose as an example. So thank you. I literally forget this every single time. I have got to get this community norm down. All right, who has not gone? Let me see. Jennifer? I don't see your face, but you're out there. There you are.
Hi, you guys. So yeah, I was eating my lunch. It's been a busy day. So the interesting thing, I'm in Detroit also, but the interesting thing about my role is that I am on a university campus and I do have the political aspect of doing this work. So for me, what I've learned in this regard on campus is that setting up norms is extremely important when working with people who you don't work with on a day-to-day basis. And so that's what I'm working on now. I'm also trying, I'm using some design thinking techniques to help get buy-in from others. This Wednesday, I actually have a workshop with some folks where we need to do some planning because they're ready to go straight to activities. And so we need to set some framework. So that has been very helpful for me in moving this ecosystem forward and getting the students at the university embedded into Detroit's ecosystem without stepping on the toes of staff and faculty who believe that you have to academically teach entrepreneurship as opposed to the applied way in which we do this work. So good challenges to have.
Great, thank you. Rob?
So I would just say that I think the world of NEI, Pam Lewis and her team, and what they've been able to do. And hearing Hassan and getting kind of the latest update is extremely inspiring and encouraging. And I'm really excited for to see Southeast Michigan continue to evolve and grow, in Detroit in particular. There's just it's an amazing city. There are amazing people there, amazing companies there. And so it was just great to hear that things are marching forward. So that was my big takeaway this afternoon.
Great, thanks for sharing, Hassan. I'm always inspired. I know Hassan took me on a little tour of Detroit when I was there in July, and he dragged Andy to go visit a small entrepreneur whose little store has been around for almost 100 years. So thanks for dragging. Hopefully Andy bought a new shirt or something. Chad, the sun looks really nice on your face. So great to see the sun come out. Hassan, do you have a takeaway?
So I just want to say thank you to everyone, and I'm happy to continue the conversation with anyone offline or share any other information that I have. If anyone wants to reach out to me on Slack or via email, I'm happy to do that. If there's anything, I guess, that I would add, it's to respect community, because I've seen a lot of things go well, but I've also seen things not go well when community feels that they've been used, where people like sweep in for focus groups and information gathering because they have ideas about doing a whole bunch of stuff. And if there's no follow through or nothing ever comes out of it, it becomes that much harder for others to come back when they have sincere efforts to do something. So I guess if there's anything that I would add, it would be that.
All right, thank you all for your time, and have a good rest of your week, and happy Halloween.
See you guys.